start. There we go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another exciting insert of our iTOOsdays. My name is Ferguson Langenhoven, and I'm one of the sales consultants at iTOO Special Risks. This morning, we have the pleasure of having a presentation by Paul Allum with regards to our K&R product. Before we do continue, I would just like to have a moment to go through some formalities. The first one of which is, for all those that are IISA members, please note that you do not have to send your certificate for the session to the IISA yourself. We will send it to them to upload it to your profile with them. So now that we're done with that, let me just read through Paul's awesome bio that I have here with me. So our K&R consultant, Paul Allum, will be going through the product offering offered to clients when they take out a K&R, which is a kidnap and ransom policy with regards to the pre and post incident. Now, Paul is a director of global risks within Unity Group and has 16 years private sector experience supporting commercial, government, and military clients. Paul specializes in security intelligence and liaison and has knowledge of protective security and operational risks. He's a former Royal Marines commando and he lives in the UK. So many African nations are experiencing an increase in kidnappings. We have definitely seen an increase in kidnappings lately. There were more than 4,000 kidnappings for ransom cases from January 2022 to September 2022. And double, which is double from 2021. Paul has first-hand experience in the increase and will be able to provide a very insightful presentation. So without further ado, Paul, I'm going to hand over to you.
Lovely, thanks, Ferguson. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, host disabled participant sharing. Ferguson, can you just give me control or authority to share my screen?
Okay, just hold on.
Yeah. That didn't work.
Did it work, Paul?
No.
That is weird because you are a co-host.
Just says host disabled participant screen sharing.
So while they're just sorting that out, let me just read another piece about kidnappings. So in South Africa, obviously we know that kidnappings have grown alarmingly over the past year. And there's an average now of 1,143 kidnappings per month reported during the first half of 2022. This is almost double the monthly average of 700 cases reported in 2021. Now, organized crime gangs are to blame for the increase in kidnapping cases. They are highly skilled. They have spotters, abductors, communicators, and negotiators, and are heavily armed. They can watch a victim for 6 months or more before they attempt to kidnap. Did that give you a little bit of more time to set yourself up, Paul?
It's not me, it's you. It's still not letting me. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
That is very weird, Paul. Very, very weird.
Hold on a minute. I'm going to send you the slides and then you can put them on.
Okay, perfect.
I'll send them to Catia. Okay.
Folks, we are sorry about this little hiccup. I think we always see when it's a tech iTOOsday, we always have tech issues. And obviously then now it's a kidnap issue. Somebody has kidnapped Paul's rights to screen sharing.
Thoroughly enjoying the theme of kidnappings in context to everything. It's also Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will go wrong with technology.
Absolutely.
Always the way.
Absolutely. Paul, I'm quickly going to change you back to an attendee, and then I'm going to ask you to, change you back to a panelist. Let me just see if that'll work. Okay. Mohammed and Sashina, I see you guys have your hands up. I've enabled your mics quickly while we sort this out in case.
So guys, just to clarify on the certificate situation, we will give you the certificate. That is still something we offer as a service. But what we are saying is you do not have to send it to the IISA yourself, because we will send it to them to attach it to your profile with them. I hope that clarifies that. Sorry, Ranel, about your load shedding. Just the circumstances of our country.
Catia, did you receive the slides?
Catia can't respond. Paul, maybe while we Katia is waiting for the slides, there's a question from Heidi. She says,
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
yeah, maybe.
No, is the answer to that.
Okay.
It's a lot of a lot of the crime, the majority of incidents are opportunistic. They're not premeditated. There is a small percentage of SAP's data which reflects the premeditated nature of attacks, and these are usually data points attributed to, you know, the types of attacks you see in the media, you know, the targeting of high net worth individuals, business people with, you know, all companies that are, you know, public facing. And so what you have are, you know, these professionalized gangs who, as Ferguson was describing, go about a what we call an attack cycle in order to target their victims, and that begins with this sort of surveillance, target selection and surveillance phase, which can last anywhere from a week, 2 weeks, depending on the target, the nature of their business, whether they have security measures in place. You know, they need to understand the target's vulnerabilities. Where is the easiest point of attack, and how will they evade the police quickly in order to, you know, take this person captive and avoid being caught. So those types of incidents are always in the media. They're still unreported, go unreported and are underreported, but the majority of cases in South Africa right now are opportunistic. They are carjackings that evolve into a kidnap situation. They are also targeting just of people on highways that look of perceived value in city centres. You had 2 incidents in Joburg recently. One was an Audi R8, or one of those sports cars. You know, these 2 SUVs, one came the other side of the road, pulled up in front of the vehicle to block it. As the driver went to reverse, another vehicle came up behind the driver and blocked them in. These are typical sort of military style tactics, and then forced the 2 occupants out of the vehicle, threw them into the back of one of the SUVs and drove off. You know, it's that brazen and well versed, and it's something that is happening in South Africa. But whether or not there is an increase in that particular type or style of attack is hard to determine, because again, you know, I've got data here, and I too have provided data about kidnappings, but it's skewed. I mean, it's just a representation of what we believe is happening in South Africa. The reality is probably, and sadly, and more worryingly, more alarmingly, far worse. And so that's what you're contending with in South Africa at the minute. A lot of opportunistic crime, a rise in premeditated attacks by more sophisticated groups. And the issue being, of course, is all of this is being propagated in the media. And so because it's being, you know, broadcast, they're a bit like Nigeria and Mexico and Haiti and all these other countries that have a high rate of this type of crime. You are seeing copycats, you know, less sophisticated or experienced groups that think, well, hang on a minute, this is what we're involved in. Now we see an opportunity within Kidnap for Ransom to finance our operations, which, you know, if it's a quickie kidnapping, it can be relatively low risk for them. and it might be relatively low reward, but in respect to the average wage in South Africa, you know, to take someone and hold them to ransom, you know, and receive a payment of under $1,000 or, you know, $1,500, whatever the equivalent is in rand, you know, that's a good day's work. And I think the difference between what I see in South Africa and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa where you see this particular type of crime is in South Africa, the kidnappers use violence. Whereas, let's say again, you know, don't want to keep comparing, but for example, in Nigeria, even in Mozambique, you don't see violence used. I had a kidnap case in Nigeria 2 weeks ago, and we were negotiating for the victim's release. They've been held for about 6 days. They were taken to the jungle. It was kind of like it was like a coastal piracy attack. And, you know, they bound the victims' wrists and feet together, ankles together, fed them beans and water 3 times a day, you know, and, you know, made threats of violence. Of course, that's what criminals do. They have to do that. They have to make threats and you have to face them down. But the victim was released unharmed after about 6 days in captivity. I had a kidnap case in South Africa last year where they beat the victim up quite badly. You know, the victim was released but had been harmed and required, you know, not just medical support but also psychological support. And that's, you know, we'll go into what Unity can do for victims. It's not just about pre-incident management. It's not just about crisis response. It's also about the post-incident resolution, and that includes providing expert PTSD counselors, stress management counselors who are there to provide the victim's family, the victim's organization, if the organization are involved, with support, with specialist stress management support to rehabilitate them and get them either back to work or, you know, mentally and physically, you know, in good order, in a better place after their captivity. So it's a bit worrying with South Africa, I have to say. That it's just very violent there. Not always, but often, and certainly in some of the cases that I've worked on, kidnappers will use violence, and in a few cases they've killed their victims.
Sure. That's intense, Paul, and exactly what you said in terms of the cases reported. That's obviously only the cases that are reported. We don't know the ones where the kidnapped person doesn't have access to kidnap and ransom services. So yeah, you can't exactly get an accurate number because there's so many kidnap and ransom incidents that are not reported that we're not aware of.
And even if they did have access, you know, very few, you'll never hear about it in the media. So unless you're compiling that data through case statistics, you're just not going to get a true, a clear picture, or any type of contextualized picture of the threat environment. I would say that in most cases, when a victim is released, the victim, the family, or the organization will not report the incident, and in fact will do everything to remain discreet and quiet because they fear retaliation by the kidnappers. So in many cases, and this is the issue with South Africa, you know, there was a police report some time ago where, you know, the South African police were essentially asking the community to do more, you know, to report these incidents, to report when they see things taking place, not just to keep quiet about it through fear of retaliation or retribution. Of course, that's very difficult when you are living in an environment that you feel insecure in.
Yes.
That, you know, the police are, I think in, you know, Gauteng, which is obviously the highest risk area in South Africa in terms of kidnapping, you know, the police are launching initiatives all the time. I mean, there's an initiative ongoing right now where they've increased the number of checkpoints in order to try and find illegal weapons, you know, vehicles that have been carjacked and are being driven illegally. There, you know, but the issue being with that, of course, is it's you know, the tactics is all well and good, but if you don't have a strategy, or if there's no relationship between the police and government, then it's ineffectual. And so there are structural issues and a limited agency that are almost creating more issues for police success, because they can't, that, you know, they're sort of hand tied to a certain extent without agency and without, you know, sorting through these issues between the operations and what, you know, what the policymakers are doing at the top.
I hear you. Paul, there's two questions while we're waiting for your presentation to come up on the screen. One of the attendees of our presentation this morning has just asked if you are seeing an increase in incidents happening in more rural areas in South Africa. And then the second question is, how long has kidnap and ransom incidents been a threat in South Africa, to your knowledge?
So the first question is, we don't know the answer, because it's in rural areas. So you know, it's happening and it's not being reported, but it's definitely happening. The difference is, I suppose, in rural areas, it's not as sophisticated, because groups don't have the same sophistication. They're not armed in the same way, or they don't have the same hostage negotiation. There's a lot of theatre and process that goes into hostage negotiation. And what if you're kidnapped, you want to be kidnapped by a semi-professional or professional gang who know about, they understand the theatre that sits behind a kidnapping and a negotiation, because you know that they're in it to make money, and they're not about to, fingers crossed, I mean, hopefully if you lead a good negotiation, then they're not going to kill the victim, because they understand the victim is a commodity and they want to make money from the victim. And they know that if they kill the victim, it's not necessarily good for their business model, because then people will say, well, you know, why would we negotiate? You kill your victims, you know. And there's obviously a duty of care obligation there to the person that is taken, but you know, it's not good for their business model to kill their victims. So in effect, in urban areas, you see more, it's a more professionalized industry. There is a market rate, a market value for the different types of victims that are taken. You know, there is a market value for a lower to middle class family. There's a market value for someone that works for an international operation, for someone that works for a state-run company. There is a market value for each of these victims. The kidnappers, if they are semi-professional, professional, will know what this market rate is, and that's where the negotiation comes in. In rural areas, the industry doesn't exist. It's opportunistic crime, and that's slightly more dangerous, because of course they don't know what they're really doing. And so our role as negotiators is to try and educate and inform the kidnappers. So, you know, they come, it's a bit like a job interview. You go in expecting X number of dollars, and then, you know, the interviewer says, well, no, actually the salary is this. And you go, oh, well, okay, well, that's what it is. I've just got to accept that. And if I want the job, I'll take it based on that salary. It's a bit like that with negotiation. They go in with a high demand because they don't know any better. And then you have to influence their thinking. It's behavioral psychology. And with amateurish groups, it's going one way. We're informing and educating, but with sophisticated groups, it's a two-way process, because they know they understand the rates, and they understand how to behave in order to get what they want. So what I would say about rural kidnappings is, in some respects, it's more dangerous because it's amateurish, but it's also, if you're talking about the victim pool, if it's a high value target, then of course it's dangerous, because as Ferguson said, these gangs that have come across from Mozambique are professionalized, well practiced, they are armed, they have networks, they have the police paid off. And when they take a high value target, they know exactly, they've got the safe houses to move this person around, or these people, they know exactly what to demand. And because they have an operation that requires financing of resources, manpower, safe houses, then they're going to demand more, because they need to pay for these things. So demands will be higher, and they will demand a higher payment. And you need to ensure that, you know, whatever your negotiation style is, that financial settlement will meet what I call their minimum real expectation.
Well, Tove just mentioned that you can try sharing your presentation now.
Oh, we're in. Okay.
Yeah, just check if it does work. Fantastic, we see it on the screen. Thank you.
Okay. let's just load up the screen.
There we go. It's on full
So we're
screen.
kind of starting a few slides in after that sort of that introduction, but just to give everyone on the call a quick overview of Unity Advisory Group. We are privately owned and wholly independent, and that means that all the advice we give policyholders is based on their best interests and not that of iTOO, of the insurer. That's important because when you're helping to negotiate a ransom payment, you're doing it with their best interests in mind and not, you know, we need to bring this ransom down as low as possible for the insurance. So that's one thing to note. As it says there, a lot of what we do as an organization is in prevention. So of course there is, you know, the crisis response, which is the important piece, if you like, of crisis management in an event. But we try and develop relationships with the client or the clients to understand where their exposure and risk lies, and then use prevention services to, you know, mitigate or, you know, circumvent the risk, and therefore reducing the potential, the possibility of an incident occurring. So pre-incident services are really important. I'll talk about them at the end of the presentation. We respond to all the types of risks under the policy. So it's not just kidnapping today. We're talking about kidnapping, but it's also extortion. There's a lot of that in South Africa. Illegal detention, threat and intimidation cases, workplace violence, you know, a missing person, and evacuation. We're heavily involved in the evacuation of policyholders out of Sudan currently. So it's, you know, that it's not just kidnapping. And the team that works for Unity they've been with Unity for a long time. We are the way the operation works is you have a team of crisis managers, myself included, who sit over the top, and then underneath us we have a globally dispersed and sort of professionally diversified network of responders. And I'll talk a bit about the response mechanism in a moment. But what that means is these responders are located in areas of the world where there is a high rate of this crime. So, for example, we have a responder in South Africa. So in the event of an incident, that responder is there to respond immediately, which speed of response as a value proposition within this industry is very important. It also means that these responders, these consultants are, you know, networked into the security apparatus, the authorities, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, all of the networks you require as a client to influence a case. So that's really important. And then, as it says there, we've responded to just under 2,000 cases now across all the, you know, the areas of the world where you see, you know, these types of risks, and of course, including South Africa. And then, because we are a small niche organization, we need infrastructure to assist us with the response operations center, so that when a client has experiences a crisis or an incident, they can call a response operations center, and there are people there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, who will answer that call and then patch it through to us. And On Call International, which is a travel security company that is specialized in emergency evacuations, especially medical evacuations, also has a crisis management team. And that team look after the response operations center for clients. And so in the event of an incident, as I'll explain shortly, the response mechanism starts with a call into the response operations center. And so that just covers off about the response structure. The dedicated research and intelligence is important because as part of that prevention piece, as part of the pre-incident consulting, if you are a client and you're operating in a high-risk area, or you're moving into an unfamiliar area, then you might want to know about that area. Now, of course, there are resources online that can assist you with pre-incident or pre-trip planning, and that travel risk management process. But there are also there's also a lot of rubbish online. So how do you determine or discern what's right and what's not? And so there is a dedicated research portal where clients have access to a repository of security information on 180 countries and more than 350 cities. And it gives you government travel alerts and advisories, traveler tips. It talks about the security situation in all of these countries and specific cities. And is a really good font of information for, for the client to sort of inform themselves or inform on the risk environment that they're traveling to. So as part of that travel risk management process, it's a really useful hub. The supporting consultants just that sit below those primary consultants, that's the PTSD and stress management counselors. It's forensic analysts or linguists. We have a whole raft of specialists or supporting consultants depending on the type of case. And these are the types of events I was speaking about that we respond to. More recently, we've included active assailant. We've been dealing with piracy events for some time, and we've been responding to these events for decades. I would say even now, 60% of the work we do is in Kidnap for Ransom. It used to be a lot more, actually. It used to be sort of 70, 80%, but there's been an evolution in kidnapping over the last 7 years where organizations, I suppose, have looked at their security assessment framework or crisis management plans. They've started to think a little more about their duty of care obligation to their employees, and so the idea of sending an employee to a high risk location or an area that might be challenging without any security measures or training in place is something of the past, I suppose, to many international organizations. And so you've seen a lowered or diminished available pool of these victims that would have otherwise been targeted. So because of that, there are fewer kidnappings. It's also that there's been an evolution in the type of kidnapping. So I was dealing with kidnappings 6, 7, 8 years ago that were mostly armed groups, FARC and ELN in Colombia, Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. I still deal with armed groups in places like DRC. It's a very different motive, intention, and mindset to dealing with those types of kidnappers. But what we see now is 95% of kidnappings are perpetrated by financially motivated criminals in urban areas. And so there's been a change, if you like, in those kidnappings. And often what we find with these types of kidnappings is we'll get a call into the response center, and it will be to report that an express kidnapping has occurred and they just want to make a claim. And it won't be that they need our assistance, because an express kidnapping, for those on the webinar that are unaware, is more like an elongated robbery. Someone experiences a carjacking, they're taken to a cash point, their ATM card is exhausted, perhaps they keep hold of them until after midnight to reach the new daily limit, and then they exhaust that limit again, and then they chuck them out on the curbside. And then, that's reported up the chain to the crisis team, who then call in. And there's a lot of that going on. So a lot of express and quickie kidnappings and fewer long duration kidnappings. Although what I would say about that is the average captivity period globally and the average captivity period in South Africa is roughly 3 to 5 days. And the average ransom demands for, let's say, a local victim, of which the victim pool of response incidents that Unity has responded to, 95% of them are local people, local employees of state-run or international operations, not foreigners, not regional expatriates. And so those local employees or local nationals are held against ransoms on average of between $20,000 and $30,000, and the payment is much, much less. And it really depends on the negotiation. But in South Africa, it could be as low as $1,000. It could be, if the negotiation doesn't go so well for various reasons, which I can talk about in a minute, it could be $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. You contrast that to a kidnapping in the DRC, for example, where it's in the hundreds of thousands as a demand, and the payment will be between $50,000 and $100,000. So that's kind of what you're like, just to give you an understanding. But then, of course, if it's a high net worth individual in South Africa, if it's a business person, then of course it's going to be hundreds of thousands in demands, and the payment will be anything close to a six-figure number. So we've kind of touched on this now, but as Ferguson said, the numbers continue to rise. I mean, I was looking at the data the other day, and it's something like 4 times higher than it was 10 years ago. Kidnap for ransom. And of course, as Ferguson said, there's I think over 1,000 kidnappings a month, and that's just the kidnappings that are reported. We talked a bit about who the perpetrators are, and of course where it's happening is Gauteng. I mean, that accounts, in SAP's data, that accounts for somewhere close to 55% of all kidnappings. And then of course you have the KwaZulu-Natal, if that's pronounced correctly. I don't think it is, but East and West Capes is East and West Capes account for another 35% of the data. So that's where it's happening, and it's targeting business people of perceived wealth. So it's certainly a deteriorating situation in South Africa. And this is how the response mechanisms works. The client experiences an incident, they call the response operations center. On-call international staff that, as I explained, they take the message. The caller will probably be asked, the typical, what happened, who was it, what happened, where, when, how. They might ask for a policy number. It doesn't matter if they don't. We can obtain that later, and then we call back immediately. And it really doesn't matter what time of the day it is. I mean, I took a call at 1 a.m. on Saturday morning. It doesn't matter. Like, we will call back immediately, and we provide telephonic advice straight away. And let's say it's a kidnap for ransom. Who's been told? First of all, we need to contain information. Are the authorities involved? If they are, do we want them involved? We have to assess their attitude towards it, their professionalism. Are they competent? Are they corrupt? Are they involved? So we determine that. We need to know who the kidnappers are, and we have a pretty good understanding of who the kidnappers are in South Africa. So we're profiling the kidnappers. And then essentially we're supporting the activation of a crisis team. Who's in the crisis team? What are their roles and responsibilities? What is the information flow between the crisis team at corporate level and the incident team at the local level? Are you deferring control and responsibility from the corporate team to the local team? What's the local team's responsibilities when it comes to dealing with hostage negotiation, communication, stakeholder management? So there's a lot that goes into that initial communication, that initial response. And then essentially we're preparing the client to talk to the hostage takers. And at the same time, if applicable, we'll deploy a consultant. Now, again, we have one in South Africa, so he would deploy if it was a kidnapping in South Africa. And then that consultant will be deployed assisting at the local level, and one of the crisis management team will be assisting at the corporate level. And we will be with the client from the commencement of that case through to its successful resolution. And I say successful because in almost all cases there is a successful resolution. In fact, the only reasons why there wouldn't be, well, actually there's 4. One is if the victim is killed during the abduction, which on rare occasion happens. They've struggled, the kidnappers, filled with adrenaline, accidentally kill them. I mean, it's happened in the past, but they keep hold of them. And if you don't ask for proof of life, then they just negotiate, get the money, and then dump the victim. So proof of life that's why proof of life is important. The second is if the individual has died of some pre-existing health condition whilst in captivity. And again, that's very rare, but it does happen. And so we have to ensure if it's a longer duration kidnapping, how do we get medical supplies to the victim? And actually, that's a really good way of softly approaching that control issue with the kidnappers. How do we take back a bit of control subtly to influence their thinking? And that's one way of doing it if the victim needs medicine. The third, and this is why we assess the professionalism and attitude of security apparatus, is, a rescue attempt which goes wrong. Even as when I was in the commandos, we trained day in, day night for hostage rescue situations when I was on the counterterrorism team. And I can tell you now, it's still filled with pitfalls and risks. Even the best intelligence in the world sometimes is spotty, doesn't have everything you need to know about, the makeup of the hostage takers. And so a rescue attempt is probably the least advisable, because it can often end in the victim being killed in friendly fire or in crossfire, or even worse, the kidnappers kill the victim because, if the victim escapes, it's bad for their business model. And of course, the fourth is if the victim tries to escape, they try to do a runner and then are mowed down by the hostage takers. So in those four examples, that's when the data is different. If a victim dies in captivity or has died during the incident, but in nearly all cases that never happens. There is a negotiation to be had. The victim is released safely, timely, and unharmed due to a successful, good negotiation. And then, as I said, at the post-incident is the operational debrief, and that's where we're helping debrief the victim so that they can understand, that all the lies the kidnappers told them about what the victim's family or the organization were trying to do, was untrue. So that they feel less aggrieved that they had to spend a week or 2 weeks in captivity. They also sometimes, I found with victims, is they want to talk to people that have either understand what it's like to go through such a mentally and physically degrading event, or have been or who have experienced it. And so we provide that support with that debrief, and of course to help lessons learned with the organization so that they can look at their security measures and ensure something like this is less likely to happen again. This was just a quick case study that I wanted to share with you. I feel like because I've talked through kidnappings quite a bit, but essentially this happened last year, and this is typical of a sort of a international operation. They did their homework, they had surveilled the victim, watched the victim, found the right place to target the victim, kidnapped the victim, held them for that amount, nearly $50,000. And then we essentially advised on that strategy for dealing with the hostage takers. And where it says there it was family led, that's where you want to be. As an organization, you really want to sit behind the family, offering all of this advice discreetly, because by doing so, the kidnappers believe they're dealing with either a lowly paid or low class, middle class family, or even if it's a high net worth family, but they're dealing with the family who don't have access to the resources, the funds that a big organization would. And so by doing that, it essentially reduces that minimum real expectation I was talking about. And that means that the captivity period will be shorter, and likely that the demand and the payment will be lower. So in an ideal textbook situation, you always want to support the family and sit behind them. And also, I think from a public policy point of view, it shows that as an organization, you're not damaging your reputation with the government by negotiating with hostage takers. You're supporting the family to do that. And it also, I suppose, if you can reduce that ransom demand and payment, then it makes, in textbook fashion, it makes that crime less attractive, because they think, well, we didn't make as much as we thought we would. Perhaps this isn't an activity we want to be involved in. And in this case, after 6 days, as it says there, we went down to $3,500. So this is, again, just finishing off, this is the advice we provide. Every case is unique. There are unique variables, the nationality of the victim or victims, the home government, the host government, the victim's family, how do you support them? The communication process throughout, the comms are very important. I always say, with casework, if you don't gain the trust of the family, then you'll probably lose the case, because what tends to happen is the family then decide, well, this organization isn't doing enough to support us. They're not doing enough to protect the safety of our loved one. And then they start talking to the kidnappers without talking to you, creating a parallel initiative, and that can complicate the negotiation and can lead to real problems later on down the line. So you want to ensure that you have family support throughout. And then, of course, dealing with media, which isn't always the case. Many of these kidnappings, the media won't be involved because they won't know about it. It's only really high-profile cases where you've got to think about a crisis comms strategy. But of course, internal comms is really important. If it's a company and it's an employee, everyone else in that organization or in that office will be thinking about, what are you doing to ensure the safety of our employee, our counterpart, you know, because if that person is harmed or dies in captivity, then of course everyone in that operation will be thinking, well, I don't want to work for this company anymore. They don't know how to look after their staff. They didn't do enough. So the internal communications process is crucially or critically important to dealing with a kidnap. All of those critical management issues. Internal comms are very important. And here is the prevention part. So a lot of what I've spoken about as response, and what we try to do with policyholders is the prevent is, it's not a sell, it's not like a hard sell, trying to make money out of these services, essentially trying to de-risk their operations. All of our pricing is commercially sensitive depending on the size and the complexity of the operation organization, but essentially what we're trying to do is help clients develop a sort of a strategic level framework for dealing with different types of risks, train their senior management team on how to manage on familiarization and how to manage a crisis, and then train their employees on practicing situational awareness and how to manage risk from before, during, and after the travel. That's really that encompasses security risk management, travel risk management, crisis management. They're really the three pillars of duty of care that need to be fulfilled by an organization in order to reduce that risk when operating in a higher risk environment. And that concludes the presentation. So I welcome any questions.
Well, thank you so much for that very insightful presentation, and well done on being able to shorten the presentation with our little kidnapping situation in the beginning of the session. Thank you so much. Obviously, when it comes to K&R matters, there is really a lot of questions that come out of the session. So I'm going to go back to one of the questions that someone asked earlier in the presentation. And they just wanted to know, just according to you, how long has Kidnap and Ransom been a threat in South Africa?
It's certainly grown in the last 5 years. I think Mozambique destabilizing in the north has made it worse because the situation in northern Mozambique has enabled organized crime groups to move more fluidly across the border. And that's worsened the sophistication of this type of crime. And I think because a bit like Nigeria, there's so much of it in the media now, and that media coverage is turning the hand of unorganized groups towards this type of crime. So that's why we're seeing an increase in it. But certainly, kidnapping in South Africa has risen. The rate has risen, if you like, in the last 5 years, specific to your client's interests. I would say Kidnap for Ransom has been going on in South Africa for decades, but it's been, kind of under the radar.
Yeah. There's another question from Saruj, and he's just asking, what is the success rate for prosecuting and breaking these criminal syndicates? Very low,
very low. Yeah. Yeah, there's not judicially, I think there is a very low, it's I think mostly to do with the processing and the fact that there's so much corruption in the judicial system that a lot of professional groups will just pay their way out or intimidate their way out of being charged for this type of crime.
100%. And then Gavin did make a statement, and I think you have discussed this already, that the more media exposure there is on these type of cases, the more kidnappings will occur.
Yeah, I think there's just a professionalized industry now, whereas before there wasn't. And so I don't think the more coverage of the more media coverage, the more, it sort of engenders more cases. I think it's just, there is a prevalence of this crime now, and the only way to reduce that prevalence is policing. And the police don't have the tools or the agency to combat this type of crime. They don't, there are very few specialized kidnap units in South Africa. There are some good ones. This is not to rubbish the South African police. There are some very good units that operate in that space, but there are also a lot of bad police, and that complicates the issue.
100%. And in Paul, have you seen an increase in the ransom requests being more cryptocurrency based globally?
No, that's still on the fringes. We've only dealt with 2 cryptocurrency ransoms. One was in Thailand and the other one was in Ukraine. It's still on the fringes. A lot of these groups aren't that sophisticated.
Okay, and then so the questions are flowing in, so please just forgive me as I rapid fire them through to you. There's another question that's come in, and they're just asking who takes the lead when the policy and KNR policy is in effect. So I would say we would immediately come through to you guys as the incident response team, crisis team, and you would take the lead in guiding the policy holder on what the next steps are. Exactly.
Most of the time the police won't be involved. The police very rarely get involved, either because they're under-resourced or there's so much of it going on that they're just not interested. You very rarely will you see the police get involved, unless it's a higher profile incident. Then we have to recognize there is a relationship there with the police and the authorities, and our role is to advise the client on how to manage that relationship. And ultimately you want to be influencing that relationship at the highest level. So if the police are involved, then we're not talking to the unit commander, we're talking to the chief of police. We're talking to the person that has influence, and then they can influence the people below them, so on and so forth. So this isn't tactical, this is strategic.
And then, Paul, we know that we've had a high-profile case recently in our country where the Motti brothers were kidnapped. Are you seeing that this trend is still continuing on thereafter, or has there been a drop-off in terms of the amount of kids being kidnapped?
No, kids are still being kidnapped. There's no drop in that trend whatsoever. It's just that I think people are more aware after that. They're much more aware after that incident. And, I would imagine, although I don't have any, I can only talk about this anecdotally, but certainly high net worth families, business people, especially within the Asian community, are taking much more care with how they socialize, where they socialize, what locations they socialize in, and a lot of them will be taking the appropriate measures to reduce the risk to their journeys and to their social, their sort of lifestyle, I suppose.
Interesting. And then there's 2 quite interesting questions. So the first one is one of our attendees has asked, there is a oil source that has been located in Namibia, and obviously our big oil companies has already started projects in Namibia. What the person would like to find out is, would that type of discovery increase the chances of kidnap and ransom cases happening in that territory?
It depends whether there's a presence of crime in that area. If there is a presence of criminal gangs, then they'll exploit that situation 100%. They'll exploit the roads that go in and out of that mining site. They will look for targets of opportunity. That's, remote working environments, especially ones that are ridden by crime, are very difficult to secure. And so any oil company or subsidiary operating in that area will have security measures in place to de-risk the potential of a kidnapping going in and out of the plant site or the mining site.
100%. And then, Paul, in terms of syndicates, including the kidnapped individual, have you seen a lot of those cases? And what is your response in those situations?
Sorry, say that again. So kidnappings,
where the kidnapped person is actually part of the syndicate, in a sense that when the the ransom gets paid over, they get a cut of it because they were involved from the beginning.
Oh, I see. So you're saying
Yeah.
that they're part of a gang, but they've been
Yes.
kidnapped. That, I mean, I haven't had any experience with that type of casework. Yeah, I can't comment on that with any sort of intelligent answer. I mean, yeah, I've just never been involved with a kidnapping where a person, whether it's I've dealt with business related kidnappings in India
Yeah.
where you know, but it's, you know, in that respect you would probably have police involvement, and you would be, you know, we would help the client seek legal advice on their options, or, you know, because there are ramifications. But it's probably, out of all of the casework, that's, you know, that's a less likely occurrence. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that explanation, Paul. There is another interesting question where the person is asking, where the kidnappers are part of the terrorism organization, are you still allowed to pay the ransom? And I think that speaks to exactly what we just spoke about now, in terms of you haven't had experience with that situation as yet, so you wouldn't be able to kind of give some guidance on that.
Well, we've dealt with plenty of kidnappings where it's a prescribed or sanctioned group. I think that's different. If it's a sanctioned group, then of course we'll seek to understand counterterrorism legislation on prescribed groups. It will also look to talk to the government about that, because most of the time, if it is a prescribed group, the host government will take a view, and so will the home government. If it's a prescribed group that's perpetrated a kidnapping, usually it will be of a foreigner and not a local. And so it really would be about seeking the advice of both governments, because often governments will be sensitive and somewhat flexible to negotiating with these types of groups, but it really will depend on the group.
Yeah.
If it is a local employee taken, I've dealt with cases for example, in Nigeria last year where, you know, it was a criminal gang masquerading as MEND, a former MEND, which was the armed group that were operating in the Delta region for many years, you know, to come across as more menacing. I've also dealt with kidnap cases where it's a terror organization that are hiding behind a criminal gang identity in order to avoid or circumvent the counterterrorism legislation. And again, all of this will come down to the government, and, you know, discussing that with the ministry, ensuring that, you know, and lawyers, to ensure that, you know, that any of those legal issues are covered off before we start negotiating. But if a government says it won't talk to a terrorist group, then often that might be a public policy issue, but behind the scenes they often will, because they don't want to see one of their citizens die as an unfortunate victim of this type of crime. And I could, you know, there are plenty of examples out there over the years where European governments, even the United States, and South Africa, actually, Stephen McGowan's a good example of that. He talked on with iTOO, I think, a while ago. You know, he was held by Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in the Sahel for, I think, 5.5, 6 years. You know, the South African government were talking to Al Qaeda, and a ransom was paid. So we can't discount talking to terrorist or prescribed groups, but we will seek advice from government.
And in Paul, an interesting comment that was made earlier is that do you have situations where the kidnapping is not financially driven, and how do you guys respond in that situation?
Absolutely. I mean, look, what we want to do is understand how to get the victim back safely. Do we pay a ransom? Does the organization have a policy for paying ransoms? Maybe they don't. Maybe there is an alternative resolution. Maybe there's a way of we can negotiate with the kidnappers that isn't money oriented. That's not always the case, but I had a case in Iraq many years ago where they kidnapped an oil worker. You know, they were looking over the fence at the oil field and thinking, well, this international oil company are taking all of our resources, making themselves rich. and we're living in penury, we're in poverty, you know, there's no resources being sent our way, and so they kidnapped one of them. And we negotiated by saying, you know, initially they wanted money. We said, look, you know, if we set a precedent by paying money, then you're gonna, you know, it's going to set an industry, and in effect it will change the kidnap risk environment in this area. Is there anything else we can do? And they said, well, you know, we really want resources, and so we set up, you know, education facilities, a water treatment plant. We looked at employment and pre-employment checking for people in the community to work in the facility. So there are sometimes alternative means to paying money, but often, and in most cases, in 95% of cases, money is always or often is the likely resolution.
And then I think I want to end off on one last question. For those who didn't have their question answered yet, I will encourage you to please reach out to Catia. I will put her email address in the chat box. But the last question I'd like to ask you, Paul, is just around social media and how that plays a part in the kidnappings. And I think in answering that question, I would just say that obviously, if the kidnappers are looking at your life and you post too much about yourself on social media, you do kind of make yourself a target based on what you post. So I think there's a kind of a sense of be careful of what you post on social media. But Paul, would you like to comment a bit more on that?
I just think it depends on your profile. If you're, you know, a person in the community that has money, or you're a businessman or business person, should I say, then of course think about your social media profile, because they will use it. That's a way of targeting. But the average person, I don't think, needs to worry too much about that. But I'd always say that, you know, always be careful of what you put on social media, because often if someone is kidnapped, the kidnappers will look at their social media profile, and then when a proof of life question is asked, if it's an easy answer, then the kidnappers can use that without having to worry about whether or not the victim is, you know, in their possession, or if indeed they're even alive. A proof of life is exactly that. We want to know that that individual is alive and well before we start negotiating. So if they've got information off that person's profile, and then the company or the family say, what's so-and-so's dog's name, but of course they know that from the social media profile, then of course they can just say, they can give the name, and then the negotiation can be had, and that's not what we want. So always be careful with what you put on social media, and just be aware that kidnappers will use anything and everything in their means to know as much about that person as possible, so that if there is a proof of life question asked, then of course they have the information on hand to possibly answer it.
Yes. Paul, thank you very much once again for your insight into a very scary topic. As Paul has said, you can see that kidnappings have really increased in our country in recent times. And our answer to that, which is not kind of enforcing that, you know, we thought of a way to kind of mitigate the risk that is associated with kidnappings through our Kidnap and Ransom product. So just thanks again, Paul, for your time and for your insight. I just need to repeat once again that for those that are worried about the certificates for the session, please note that your certificate will be uploaded onto AC Develop for you to download. We will then send those certificates to the IISA on your behalf, so you do not have to send it to them for record purposes. Paul, thank you once again. For those who do not have their questions answered, I will remind you that you can reach out to Catia. Her email address is Catia, CATIA @iTOO.co.za. If there isn't anything more, thank you so much for your time, ladies